welcome back home, I think I should say, shouldn't I?
Right.
It's incredible. Bob, I think my first question is really, did you ever, in your wildest dreams, when you were starting to build these instruments years and years ago, think that this is what it would come to?
No, in fact, we didn't think much of anything. Everything we did for fun of it.
Yeah.
Had no idea where it would go.
Right, because obviously your pioneering work in this has produced this whole field of music. Do you think that the fun is still there for people, or?
Yeah, it's different now. Back then you could do hardware on the kitchen table. Now it's much harder, but you can do software on the kitchen table.
Right, right.
So it's if you're an amateur, computer systems are the place to work.
Right, right. One thing which I think is very true nowadays is everything is very marketing led. I get the feeling when you started, you were obviously not marketing led because there was no marketing to base your thoughts on. But did you talk to musicians? How did you start?
Yeah, I worked with musicians one by one.
Right.
We got started because one musician asked me if I knew anything about electronic music.
Right.
And out of that arose the idea for these modular systems here. But back then, in the late 60s, this sort of equipment was not even considered musical instruments. It was considered professional audio equipment that you would use in a studio.
Right. And what made you change? What made you think, hang on a minute, there's an instrument here, not just a piece of audio equipment?
Well, it was the musicians who thought about it. We kept...
In particular?
We kept... no one in particular at that time. There were several dozen, maybe 100 musicians who said, you know, we really like something that we can carry around and play on the gig. I said, play? You know, this is studio equipment. No, we want something, you know, it's got a keyboard. We want something that we can set up and do a 3-hour session with and walk out with.
Right.
That was the beginning of the Mini Moog. And once we designed the Mini Moog, we decided to try and show it at the Music Merchants Convention. That was a bit strange for those music merchants back then. None of them thought that stuff like this with knobs and patch chords and words like oscillator and envelope, you know, would sell to musicians.
Right.
I mean, they didn't understand it. How could the musicians understand it?
Right.
But the musicians understood it right fast, and from that the music merchants learned.
Right, right. Well, one thing, before you started, I mean, you grew up, if you like, building theremins, which obviously had no keyboard controller.
Yeah.
When did the whole idea that these instruments should be keyboard controlled come into play? Was that something that you had an influence in, or was that something which grew up around you?
At the beginning, the keyboard was always one of many possible options.
Right.
Keyboard supplied a control voltage. The control voltage changed the pitch and set the sound off. But other devices did the same thing. Ribbon controller did that. We had buttons and switches and doorbells, that sort of thing. The keyboard became commercially important when musicians tried to play conventional music on it, and the keyboard has remained important since then.
Right. Do you think, obviously now since MIDI has been around, we're getting back to other controllers for pieces of what could be called synthesizers, from things like the stick or guitar or wind synthesizer? I mean, do you think this is a good thing that we get back to other non-keyboard controllers, because obviously music has become very keyboard based?
I think definitely that there's an unending variety of alternate controllers that you can think of. You know, besides the wind controller and the guitar controller and the drum controller, you can imagine things that have no counterpart in conventional instruments.
Right, right.
You know, like the ribbon controller and the theremin.
Right, they don't play to a scale.
Yeah. And there's just no end of things you can think of. And we're trying them out and seeing which ones the musicians like.
Right, well that's good. Walter Carlos and Switched On Bach obviously was a very, very important moment in your and Synthesizer's
It certainly was.
career. I've always had a feeling in a way that because of his incredible musicianship, he planted the seed in people's minds that the synthesizers in that time, in the mid-60s, could do far more than they actually could do. And that in a way we're kind of still suffering because people heard that album and they thought, well, synthesizers can do everything, which they couldn't at the time, obviously. Were you aware of this? When Switched On Bach came out and the reception it got, did you think, oh my God, you know, now I've got to build what people think I've already built, or what was your reaction?
That's not exactly the way we thought about it. We recognized that Carlos had a unique talent, and the music that came out was a result of his unique talent, and the instrument was just a tool for manifesting that talent. Other musicians had talents too, but in different directions. What happened in the 60s, 69 and 70s is that a lot of other music producers figured, well, Carlos was successful and Carlos used a synthesizer, therefore the synthesizer is the gimmick. And if I get a synthesizer too, I can be as successful as Carlos. You'd be surprised how many music producers thought that, how many records were put out in the late 60s, Moog this, Moog that, and most of them flopped because the talent wasn't there, the vision wasn't there, and just the chops, the knowledge of how to use a system like that wasn't there.
That's right. Did you work with him at the time on the design of instruments? I mean,
yes.
How close?
Yeah, Carlos always had ideas.
Right.
Every time we visited him, we got instructions, if you will, or orders,
right.
or ideas to do new things.
Right, right. Jumping several decades.
Yeah.
Nowadays, a lot of kids are using, 17, 18, who weren't even born when the Mini Moog was even built, are looking back to analog synthesizers, maybe using sample CDs. How do you think this is good that we look back, or do you think people should be looking for? How do you view this?
Well, sure. Looking back connects us with the thoughts and the approaches, the human part of all this. People didn't build these things by following formulas out of an engineering book. People built these things by responding to needs, by responding to the desires of musicians. I'm very much a believer in the network of the imagination. That a lot of us thought of the same thing at roughly the same time. Don Buchla, I did. There were other people. Harold Boda was doing the same sort of work. We were on the network. And I can't tell you more specifically than that, but the ideas became available, and we responded to them.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is evidence of that.
Right. But do you think that analog synthesizers' place in the current field of music is as a sort of harking back to an era, or has it a future? Has it a future role? I mean, do you think these instruments can come back in a really positive way?
The design
with sampling and MIDI and everything, which is obviously takes up people's time.
The design philosophy behind analog can come back. The design philosophy is that you have continuous variables and you have complete open-ended flexibility. You don't have that with a sampling instrument. What you have are canned sounds. They may be good sounds, but they're canned. They're always the same. You can't fine-tune them. The big thing about analog, as you can see with all these knobs, is that everything was accessible. All you had to do was reach up and turn. And that gave you the ability to be a real-time instrument designer and sound designer as well as a performing musician. Right,
right. I've often wondered if it kind of depresses you in a way that the keyboard player has become such a sort of a purveyor of static sounds, presets and stuff, and obviously where you started it was completely the opposite. Everything was fluid, everything was analog in every sense of the word. Whereas, obviously, in the 80s and 90s, with presets and sampling, people are just triggering sounds with one finger, or they're just pressing a button and there's the flute sound. Does that kind of spoil it for you? I mean, are you sad that it's come to that, or do you think...
No, nothing has really spoiled it for me.
Right.
Because in the long view, the stuff that's not musically valid, the stuff that has minimal musical interest doesn't last. It goes into the garbage pail. And when a musical need arises for fluidity, for multidimensional control, the musicians will respond.
Yeah, yeah. How did musicians respond to this baby over here? This is.
Well,
were they completely confused by it, or what?
Every musician responded differently.
Yeah.
Someone like Carlos would look at this, and immediately the hands would be going and turning the knobs even before they were already in contact with them.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. Shall I?
Yeah. Sorry. Back to Carlos.
If somebody like Carlos would look at a system like this for the first time and immediately understand what to do, his hands would be going and turning the knobs even before he touched them. Other musicians would go like this, and they'd freeze, you know, they'd freak out. And then there were all kinds of musicians in between that were intimidated at first, but they dug in. But what you find in general is that every knob on this has some musical meaning. It may occur to you in the first 10 seconds, or it may take a couple of weeks or a couple of months to really figure out. But you begin to think of changing sounds. Here's a sound, and a knob like this now would turn up vibrato. Now that's something you can hear. You don't have to study an engineering book to hear that. This knob here would change the speed of the vibrato. This whole device you think of as a device that creates a vibrato. It happens to be called a modulating oscillator. Modulation means to vary rapidly. Here's a device called a filter. This is a device that lets through certain harmonics and cuts out others. And if I were to open the filter a little bit, you can hear more and more of the harmonics. So this knob too has an effect on the sound that is 100% musical, and you just get to know what that knob does, and after a short time you begin to reach for it instinctively. And at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, there were enough musicians around who would be so conversant with and so in control of a system like this that they could go into a session and the producer would say, "Give me a sound, you know, like a falling asparagus," and you know, immediately the hands would go like this,
right.
And in 10 seconds or 15 seconds there would be the sound.
What was there not the same need to recreate sounds at that time? I mean, was it always creation rather than recreation?
It began strictly with creation.
Right.
Our first customers were experimental musicians in universities and in private studios. The next group of musicians to adopt the use of a system like this were the commercial music producers. And what they found was that they could, for the first time, they could take a sound and tailor it anywhere in the spectrum, from a completely conventional sound that sounded like a violin to something completely freaky and new, or anywhere in between. You know, they could impart just the right degree of humor or strangeness or familiarity to it. Right. And that was extremely valuable. It was only after a lot of records were made and people began to think of this incorrectly, as it turns out, that somehow it was a recreator of conventional sounds, that people began to be concerned with exactly how much like a violin or how much like a trumpet it could sound.
Yeah, so the whole emphasis shifted.
Yeah.
Speaking of value, what would this have cost in the 1960s?
A system like this is not a 100% standard system, but this might have cost $5,000 or $6,000,
right.
Which was a lot of money back then.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money now.
Well, it was much more then.
Yeah. What year would this have been built in then?
This looks like several years. It could have been as early as 1967 and as late as 1977.
Right. So you would have actually built part of this?
I wouldn't be surprised. From the front, it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
But I was personally involved in the building of these things up until 1971, and then I was on the sidelines up until 1978.
Great. Well, Bob, thank you very much indeed.
Well, you're welcome.
Enjoy the rest of the museum.
Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed it so far.
Great.